The first thing I saw when I opened that envelope was not a warning, not a request, not even a simple conversation. It was a demand. 72 hours. That was all the time they gave me to leave the house I had just inherited from my grandmother. The house where I learned how to bake cookies on Saturday mornings, where I spent every summer growing up, where my grandmother kept every birthday card I ever gave her in a little wooden box by the fireplace. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 29 years old, and I never imagined that inheriting my grandmother's home would turn into the biggest fight of my life. When my grandmother, Helen Carter, passed away at 92, I thought losing her would be the hardest thing I'd ever experience. I was wrong. The hardest part came 3 weeks later, when a homeowners association I barely knew decided they could take away the last thing she left me. Helen's house sat quietly at the end of Willow Creek Lane, a small neighborhood outside Asheville, North Carolina. It wasn't some giant mansion or luxury estate. It was a simple 3-bedroom home with a wide front porch, old oak trees in the backyard, and a kitchen that still smelled like cinnamon because my grandmother had spent decades making it feel like home. The house was completely paid off, valued at around $510,000, and after years of renting apartments and wondering if I would ever have a place that truly belonged to me, it felt like my grandmother had handed me a second chance. I was an elementary school teacher. I loved my job, but teachers don't exactly become wealthy. Most months I was choosing between saving for the future and fixing something in my apartment that broke again. So when the attorney called and told me Helen had left the house to me, I cried. I thought, she finally gave me the security she always wanted me to have. But there was something in her will that confused me. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about the house itself. It was one sentence written near the bottom of the page. Emily, be careful with the neighborhood association. They have been waiting for me to leave. At first, I smiled when I read it. I honestly thought my grandmother was just being stubborn. That was Helen. She was the type of woman who would argue with the parking meter if she thought it was unfair. She once returned a toaster because the buttons felt disrespectful. That was my grandmother. Tough, funny, and impossible to intimidate. I assumed she had probably gotten into some disagreement with the HOA over something small, maybe a flower bed or a mailbox. I didn't understand what she meant until I started going through her old files. A few days after the funeral, I was sitting on the floor in her office, surrounded by decades of paperwork, looking for anything related to the property. Tax documents, insurance records, old repair bills. My grandmother kept everything. She had receipts from appliances she bought in the 1980s. She had instruction manuals for things she didn't even own anymore. But then I found a folder hidden behind a row of old gardening books. Inside were letters from the Pine Ridge Community Association. And that was the moment I realized my grandmother hadn't been exaggerating. For almost 8 years, the HOA had been trying to buy her property. Not politely, not casually. They wanted that land badly. The reason was simple. My grandmother's house sat on the only access road leading to a large empty section of land behind the neighborhood. A developer had plans for an expensive luxury community with private gates, modern homes, and a fancy clubhouse. But there was one problem. They needed my grandmother's property. Without it, their entire expansion plan became complicated. The letters started friendly at first. They offered money, then more money. Then they started adding pressure. This is a great opportunity for everyone, one letter said. But Helen saw right through it. She wrote notes in the margins of those letters. They don't want to help me. They want my land. She refused every offer. She told them the house was not just a number on a spreadsheet. It was where she raised her children, where she watched my mother grow up, and where she wanted to spend her final years. After that, the tone changed. The friendly conversations disappeared. The HOA stopped acting like neighbors and started acting like people who believed they were entitled to win. Then, just weeks after Helen's funeral, while I was still dealing with probate paperwork and trying to figure out how to live in a house full of memories, the letter arrived. The HOA claimed I owed $47,500 in unpaid violations. They said my grandmother had ignored dozens of warnings over the years. They listed everything from peeling paint to driveway cracks, fence measurements, landscaping issues, even a claim that her front yard had not been properly maintained. According to them, Helen had received 76 violation notices and refused to cooperate. I remember sitting at that kitchen table, the same table where my grandmother taught me how to play cards, staring at those papers and thinking, how is this even possible? Because if there was one thing I knew about Helen Carter, It was that she never ignored anything. A bill could arrive 5 minutes before dinner and she would stop everything to deal with it. So I searched through every box, every cabinet, every drawer in that house looking for those supposed warnings. I found thousands of documents. I found birthday cards from people who had moved away decades ago. I found recipes written in her handwriting. I found a newspaper clipping from the day I won my first teaching award. But I found absolutely nothing from the HOA. Not one warning, not one complaint, not one certified letter. And that was when I started asking the question that changed everything. What if they weren't trying to collect a debt? What if they were trying to create one? I knew I was dealing with people who had more resources than me, more experience than me, and probably expected me to panic. But they didn't know one important thing. I wasn't alone. My boyfriend, Daniel Reeves, wasn't just someone listening to me vent after work. He was a property attorney who had spent years fighting questionable HOA practices, and when I finally placed those papers in front of him, he stopped reading after about 10 minutes. He looked up at me and said, "Emily, this isn't a normal HOA dispute. Something about this feels wrong." And that was the moment I realized the fight for my grandmother's house was only beginning. Daniel spent the next few days going through every document the HOA had sent me. And I remember watching him sit at my grandmother's old dining table surrounded by papers, coffee cups, and his laptop, looking more confused with every page he opened. Normally, Daniel was the kind of person who could read a complicated contract and explain it in a way that made sense. He was calm, patient, almost annoyingly calm sometimes. I used to joke that someone could tell him his car was stolen and he would probably ask for the police report before getting angry. But that night was different. I could see something changing on his face. He wasn't just frustrated. He was concerned. Finally, he closed the folder, leaned back in the chair where my grandmother used to sit every morning, and said something I will never forget. "Emily, I think they made these violations up." Hearing those words was strange because part of me already suspected it, but hearing someone else say it made everything feel real. I asked him how that was possible. I asked how an entire homeowners association could send official-looking paperwork with dates, signatures, and dollar amounts if it was all fake. Daniel explained something I didn't understand before. Sometimes people don't need to create a perfect lie. They just need to create enough confusion. They rely on people being overwhelmed. They rely on homeowners thinking, maybe I forgot something. Maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I should just pay and move on. And honestly, that was probably exactly what they expected from me. They expected a young woman who had just lost her grandmother to be too exhausted to fight. They expected me to see a $47,500 bill and think, I can't afford a lawyer. I can't win this. They expected me to walk away. But they made one mistake. They underestimated how much that house meant to me. Daniel started digging deeper. He requested the HOA's internal records, communication logs, inspection reports, and proof that the alleged violation notices had actually been delivered. Because according to the HOA, my grandmother had ignored dozens of certified warnings over several years. But when Daniel asked for proof of delivery, something interesting happened. The HOA stopped responding as quickly. The confident tone from their letters disappeared. The same people who had threatened to take my grandmother's home suddenly needed more time to review their records. That was when I knew we were getting close to something. A week later, Daniel received a package from the HOA. It contained copies of their alleged notices. At first glance, everything looked official. Dates, descriptions, photos. But Daniel noticed something small that nobody else would have caught. The dates didn't match reality. He grabbed a calendar and started comparing every violation day with my grandmother's medical history. And then we found it. Not one mistake. Not two mistakes. 34 separate violations that happened when my grandmother physically could not have been at the house. There was a violation claiming her lawn was neglected on a day when she was recovering in a rehabilitation center after surgery. Another claimed she ignored a fence issue during a week when hospital records show she had been admitted for treatment. One notice even claimed an inspector had spoken with her directly on a day when she was staying with my mother because she was too weak to live alone. I remember looking at those records and feeling something I had never felt before. It wasn't just anger. It was disbelief. Someone had looked at an elderly woman, someone who had lived peacefully in the same home for 43 years, and decided she was an obstacle. Not a neighbor, not a person, an obstacle. Daniel told me we needed to move quickly. He filed an emergency request to stop any collection action while the investigation continued. But before the hearing, The HOA president, Richard Caldwell, decided to make one more move. He called me directly. I still remember standing in my grandmother's kitchen when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer because I didn't recognize the number. When I picked up, a man introduced himself as Richard, the president of Pine Ridge Community Association. His voice was polite, but there was something underneath it, the kind of politeness people use when they already think they have won. "Emily," he said, "I understand this situation is emotional for you, but you need to understand that your grandmother was difficult. She fought every rule. We are simply trying to restore the neighborhood." I looked around that kitchen, at the pictures of my grandmother on the wall, and I asked him, "Restore the neighborhood by taking her home?" There was a pause. Then he said something that made my stomach turn. "Sometimes individual property decisions have to serve the greater community." That sentence told me everything. They didn't see my grandmother's house as a home. They saw it as a piece of a development plan, a piece they had been waiting years to control. I told Richard we would see him in court, and for the first time during this entire nightmare, I heard a little uncertainty in his voice. The court hearing happened on a rainy Tuesday morning. I remember walking into that courtroom, nervous, holding a folder of documents so tightly my hands hurt. Across from me sat Richard and two HOA board members. They looked confident. They had expensive suits, professional attorneys, and the attitude of people who believed paperwork automatically meant they were right. But then Daniel began presenting the evidence. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. He simply walked the judge through the timeline, one violation after another, one impossible date after another. Medical records, hospital records, rehabilitation documents, missing delivery confirmations. The room became quieter with every piece of evidence. The HOA attorney tried to explain that there may have been administrative errors, but Daniel stopped him with one simple question. How many administrative errors happen before they become intentional? Nobody answered. The judge reviewed the documents carefully. For nearly 15 minutes, the courtroom was silent. Then he looked up and asked the HOA representatives a question that changed everything. "Are you telling this court that your organization issued dozens of violations against a woman who was hospitalized or physically unable to comply, and you never verified the facts?" The HOA attorney started explaining, but the judge cut him off. "That was not my question." And right there, I saw something I never thought I would see. The confidence disappeared from Richard Caldwell's face, because for the first time, someone with authority was looking at him and not seeing a powerful HOA president. They were seeing someone who might have gone too far. The judge did not make a final decision that day, but he issued an immediate order preventing the HOA from taking any action against the property. And as we walked out of that courtroom, Daniel looked at me and said, "Emily, they thought they were buying a house. They forgot they were creating a case." But the biggest moment was still coming, because the next hearing would reveal exactly how far the HOA had gone and what would happen when the truth finally reached everyone in that community. The final hearing happened almost a month later, and by then the entire neighborhood knew something was wrong. People who had ignored the situation at first started asking questions. Some neighbors quietly admitted they had received strange notices from the HOA before. Others said they always felt like decisions were being made behind closed doors. What started as my grandmother's fight slowly became a much bigger conversation about power, trust, and what happens when the people in charge forget who they are supposed to serve. When we walked into that courtroom again, I felt different. I was still nervous, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't the grieving granddaughter who had just inherited a house and didn't know what to do. I was someone who had spent weeks uncovering the truth about what happened to my grandmother. The judge reviewed everything one final time. The fabricated violations, the missing delivery records, the impossible dates, and the evidence showing that the HOA had continued pushing forward even when they had no legitimate proof. His decision was clear. The court dismissed the entire $47,500 claim against me and ruled that the HOA had acted improperly and intentionally created false violations in an attempt to pressure an heir into surrendering property. The judge ordered the association to pay damages, cover legal expenses, and compensate me for the harm caused. The final amount came to $142,000, but honestly, the money was never the part that mattered most to me. What mattered was hearing those words out loud, that my grandmother was right. She knew something was happening. She knew they were waiting for her to be gone, because they thought nobody would fight after she left. They were wrong. The fallout was bigger than anyone expected. Richard Caldwell resigned as HOA president before the community could remove him, and several board members faced personal legal action because the evidence showed they had approved decisions based on information that was not truthful. The luxury development project behind our neighborhood collapsed almost immediately. Investors who had been interested in building expensive homes didn't want their names connected to a property dispute involving allegations of fraud. The land they thought was guaranteed suddenly became uncertain. The people who believed they could control everything with paperwork and pressure found out that paperwork works both ways. Today, I still live in my grandmother's house. I still drink coffee on the same front porch where she used to sit every morning. I still walk through the garden she planted decades ago. And sometimes I catch myself expecting her to open the back door and tell me I'm watering the flowers wrong. The house hasn't changed much. The old floors still creak. The kitchen cabinets are still a little crooked. The walls still have small imperfections that someone else might call flaws. But to me, those things are what make it home. And every time I look at that house, I think about the lesson my grandmother left behind. A home is not just property. It is history. It is memories. It is the people who lived there before you and the stories they leave behind. The people who tried to take it from you saw a piece of land. My grandmother saw a lifetime. And that difference is why they lost. But I also learned something else from this entire experience. Communities need rules. HOAs can serve a purpose when they are used fairly and responsibly. The problem begins when rules become weapons and when a small group of people starts believing they have the right to control the lives of everyone around them. So now I want to ask you something. If you were in my position, would you have fought the HOA all the way to court? Or would you have taken the easier path and walked away? Do you think organizations like HOAs sometimes have too much power? Or do you believe these rules are necessary to protect communities? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because this conversation is bigger than just my grandmother's house. It's about fairness, ownership, and whether ordinary people still have a voice when they stand against powerful groups. If you believe family legacies are worth protecting, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe, because the next story might be another reminder that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who has the strongest case.